So now that we've seen what Nozick's view is, we need to return to the skeptical argument we started with. We got to ask two questions. Firstly, is it true that on Nozick's theory we can know ordinary propositions? What does he say about knowledge of ordinary propositions? And secondly, we got to ask, if indeed we can know ordinary propositions, then which premise of the skeptical argument is Nozick going to reject? Because of course, if we do know ordinary propositions, then some premise of the skeptical argument has to be false, given that it's a valid argument. So we're going to take these questions in sequence. The answer, as you'll have suspected, to the first question is that indeed we can know ordinary propositions according to Nozick. And the way we'll try to see why this is so is by focusing on the first sensitivity condition that we mentioned earlier. The condition that if P had been false, you wouldn't have believed P. So remember, we want to try and get a sense of why is it true that I know an ordinary proposition like I have hands. This is our ordinary proposition. So remember at the very end of the first component of the lecture, we contrasted two big picture ideas about knowledge. One was the skeptic's view of knowledge, and the skeptic's view of knowledge was something like, in order to know a proposition, you have to be able to rule out all possible worlds where the proposition is false. We contrasted that with this relevant alternatives picture, where the idea was that, well, maybe to know something, you're not required to rule out all the possibilities, you're only required to rule out the relevant alternatives to that proposition. And in a way, Nozick's sensitivity condition is a way of spelling out this relevant alternatives idea. Because what he's saying is that, well, in order to know something, it only must be the case in the most similar worlds where that proposition is false. You wouldn't have believed it. But it need not be the case that in absolutely every possible world, where in particular, say, an ordinary proposition is false, you would believe it to be false. In particular, it may not need to be true of you that in a skeptical scenario where an ordinary proposition is false, you would believe it to be false. So let's think through that in a little bit more detail. So we'll draw a picture once more. We're going to start with the actual world, where of course I do have hands. And where of course I believe that I have hands. Let's also draw in our skeptical scenario, which we'll call SS. And in our skeptical scenario, I am a brain in a vat. And because the mad scientist is intent on deceiving me, everything seems as it would in a normal world. Everything seems to me here just the same as it seems here. So I come to believe I have hands. So here, the ordinary proposition is true and I believe it. Here, the ordinary proposition is false because it's false in any world where I'm a brain in a vat. But I continue to believe the ordinary proposition. So we'll draw our arrow again, indicating the worlds are getting less similar as we go this way. And we got to ask ourselves, is this the most similar world where the relevant ordinary proposition is false? Is this the most similar world where I don't have hands? And when you think about it for a moment, you'll see the answer is, well, obviously not. There are much more mundane possibilities where I lack hands than these very weird scenarios where I'm a brain in a vat. Let's just pick one of them. Let's imagine that I was in some kind of accident and lost my hands. So I'm in an accident and I lose my hands. What are my beliefs going to be like in a world where I'm in an accident and lose my hands? Is that going to be a world where I continue to believe I have hands? Well, of course not. It looks like it's going to be a world where I'm very upset about the fact that I don't have hands. But being upset about the fact that I don't have hands is of course going to require me to correctly believe I don't have hands. So here, I don't believe I have hands. In fact, I believe I don't have hands. I correctly believe I don't have hands. Now let's ask ourselves, let's focus on the sensitivity condition. When applying it to the ordinary proposition, it says, if it had been false that I have had, if it had been false that I had hands, I wouldn't have believed that I had hands. Or in other words, in all the most similar worlds where I don't have hands, I also don't believe that I have hands. Is that a picture where that condition is true? And in fact, it looks like it is. And it looks like it is a picture where it's true, even though we have these skeptical scenarios where the ordinary proposition is false, but I nonetheless believe it. Because these are not the most similar worlds where the ordinary proposition is false. Because it's a brain in a vat world, it is a world where I don't have hands, but it's not the most similar world where I don't have hands. The most similar worlds where I don't have hands are worlds much more like this one, where I'm in an accident. And because that's, being more or less the same but in an accident is much more like the actual world than being a brain in a vat. And of course, in those worlds, I don't believe I have hands because I'm aware that I was in the accident, and I respond appropriately with my beliefs. So if we look at a kind of what looks like a plausible picture of what's going on in terms of the more or less similar worlds, it looks like the sensitivity condition is met. It is indeed true that had the ordinary proposition been false, I wouldn't have believed it, even though these skeptical worlds exist. So this is the sense in which we're kind of spelling out this relevant alternatives idea. Just because I continue to believe that I have hands in a world like this, it's still perfectly possible for me to know the ordinary propositions, because to determine whether this counterfactual is true, these worlds aren't relevant, because they're not the most similar. So that's just one of the conditions we need to look at. So, of course, what are the other conditions on knowledge? Well, it's got to be true. Is that true? Yes, of course it's true that I have hands in the it's of course true that I have hands in the actual world. Is it something I believe? Yes, it is. And we won't go through the final sensitivity condition, but the same kind of reasoning, I think, will show you that, at least in how Nozick intended it, the final sensitivity condition is met. So it looks like in Nozick's theory we can indeed know ordinary propositions, even though skeptical scenarios exist. So the answer to this question is yes. So we've just seen why on Nozick's theory it is possible to know ordinary propositions, like the proposition that you have hands. So the answer to the question is yes. At the very beginning, we saw this simple, compelling argument that knowledge of such things is impossible. So now we got to revisit that argument and see which premise does Nozick reject. So just remember quickly, the first premise of the argument was that you don't know heavyweight propositions. So you don't know things like that you're not a brain in a vat. The second premise was this conditional premise, which linked knowledge of ordinary propositions to knowledge of heavyweight propositions. In particular, if it said, if you don't know a heavyweight proposition, like you're not a brain in a vat, then you also don't know an ordinary proposition, like that you have hands. And perhaps surprisingly, the premise that Nozick denies is actually the conditional premise. You might have thought what he was going to say is that actually it is possible to have knowledge of heavyweight propositions. It is possible to know that you're not a brain in a vat. But actually he denies the second premise. He says that is false because you can simultaneously know that an ordinary proposition is true. You can know that you have hands, for instance, while also not knowing a heavyweight proposition, while simultaneously, for instance, not knowing that you're not a brain in a vat. So again, we're going to look at this through a picture to help us get a sense of why that is. So in particular, we're going to explain why on his theory it's true that you know you have hands, while at the same time it's true that you don't know that you're not a brain in a vat. And if we show that, that will be sufficient to show that on his theory, the second premise is false. Now, we've already explained why you know the ordinary proposition here, so we're going to concentrate entirely on this the heavyweight proposition that you're not a brain in a vat. We're going to explain why you don't know that in this scenario. And it's going to turn out the reason why you don't know that is because when we focus instead on the heavyweight proposition, when we put in for P the heavyweight proposition, this sensitivity condition now fails. So we're going to go through this using the diagram again. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add one more world to help us think through this case. I'm going to add one more brain in a vat world. But unlike this brain in a vat world, where, you're a normal sort of rational person, you just happen to suffer the misfortune of being a brain in a vat. In this world, you're not only a brain in a vat, but you're a paranoid brain in a vat. You're an irrationally paranoid brain in a vat. So we'll suppose that even though you have no reason to suspect that you're a brain in a vat, you have this paranoid belief that you are. So you're paranoid, and you believe you're a brain in a vat. Okay. So what we want to do is we want to look at this picture and we want to show that the sensitivity condition, when P is our heavyweight proposition, is false. And the way we're going to do that, so because our heavyweight proposition has a negation in it, it's a little bit of a mouthful. This thing amounts to saying, if it were false that you're not a brain in a vat, you wouldn't have believed that you're not a brain in a vat. Put slightly more simply, it says, if you were a brain in a vat, you wouldn't have believed that you were not a brain in a vat. So just to simplify that even further, what we're going to show is that the following is true. That if you were a brain in a vat, you still would have believed that you were not a brain in a vat. So we're going to show that even if you were a brain in a vat, you still would have believed you were not a brain in a vat. And if you think through it just for a few minutes and you permute all the negations, you'll see that if this is true, the corresponding instance of the sensitivity condition we started with must be false. So by showing this is true, we'll thereby show that your beliefs are not sensitive in the right way, and so you can't have knowledge of the heavyweight proposition. So let's see, why is this counterfactual true? Why is it true that if you had been a brain in a vat, you still would have believed that you were not a brain in a vat? Well, when we were thinking about the ordinary proposition that you have hands, we saw that you shouldn't focus on the brain in a vat worlds. You should focus on these more similar worlds, because these are the most similar worlds where the ordinary proposition is true. But now that we're no longer thinking about knowledge of the ordinary proposition, now that we're thinking about knowledge of the heavyweight proposition, we actually are not looking at this world anymore. Because this is not a world where it's false that you're a brain in a vat. This is not a world where you are a brain in a vat. So it can't be the most similar world where you're a brain in a vat. Remember, if we're thinking about the counterfactual, we want to show that the counterfactual, if you were a brain in a vat, you still would have believed you were not one, is true. We got to look at the most similar worlds where you're a brain in a vat. This is not a world where you're a brain in a vat, so it can't be the most similar world where you're a brain in a vat. So if we want to consider whether this counterfactual is true, we instead have to look at this half of the diagram, because these are the two worlds where you're a brain in a vat. And given what we've said, supposing that you're a normal rational person and that you don't sort of, without reason, irrationally suppose that you're a brain in a vat, it looks like this is actually the most similar world where you are a brain in a vat. The most similar world where you're a brain in a vat is one where you're like how you are, you're not given to irrationally think that you're a brain in a vat, but you suffer the misfortune of being fed this misleading evidence. So you think that you have hands, while in fact you're a brain in a vat. But of course, if you think you have hands, well, having hands rules out being a brain in a vat. So in a situation like this, you must also believe that you're not a brain in a vat. So now, let's finally consider this counterfactual. Is it true that if you had been a brain in a vat, you still would have believed you were not one? Well, if this is the most similar world where you're a brain in a vat, then that counterfactual is indeed true. Because it's obviously the most similar world where where you are a brain in a vat, but there you don't believe you are, because you go along with the evidence that you're being given. So what we've seen is that when we look at the sensitivity condition that corresponds to the heavyweight proposition, in fact it fails. What's true of you is that if you had been a brain in a vat, you still wouldn't have believed you were one, because you would be being misled. But if that's true, then it means that your beliefs are not sensitive in the right way. And remember, sensitivity is one of the necessary conditions for knowledge. If your beliefs don't meet this sensitivity condition, they can't count as knowledge. So what we've now done is we've seen that on Nozick's theory, the premise of the skeptical argument that he denies is the conditional premise. He thinks it's possible to at once know an ordinary proposition, like the proposition that you have hands, while not knowing the corresponding heavyweight proposition that you're not a brain in a vat. So that's his solution to skepticism. Sensitivity allows you to have knowledge of ordinary propositions, but it nonetheless resists the skeptical argument because it denies the second premise. It denies the premise that follows from closure. Okay, so let's recap what we've done today. We started by reminding ourselves of what the skeptical argument was. We then talked about counterfactuals as a warm-up to Nozick's theory. We saw how to recognize a counterfactual, and then we gave a simple theory of what counterfactuals mean, and we gave some examples to help get comfortable with how the theory works. Using that understanding of counterfactuals, we then moved on to Nozick's theory of counterfactuals. We saw that on Nozick's theory, knowledge is true, what you might call sensitive belief. In order to know it, you not only must know something, you not only must believe something, and for the thing to be true, but it also must be that it satisfies these two counterfactual conditions. And we saw that the most important counterfactual condition was this condition that said, if the relevant proposition had been false, then you wouldn't have believed it. Just now, we have taken our understanding of Nozick's theory and considered where does that leave skepticism. We saw that the sensitivity condition that's really important for Nozick's theory, it does allow for knowledge of ordinary propositions, but it has this funny property that it allows you to at once know an ordinary proposition and fail to know the heavyweight proposition, even though the ordinary proposition entails the heavyweight proposition.